and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka. You can find me elsewhere online as the Crimson Stitchery, including on Instagram and on my website, thecrimsonstitchery.com. Relevant links to this video can be found in the show notes on my blog, as well as in the down bar here on YouTube. So hello and welcome to the February edition of my studio vlog, aka knitting podcast, where I chat about what I've been up to over the last month, mainly what I've been making, what I've been knitting, and also what I have been thinking. I have managed to finish quite a few little long-standing knitting projects as part of my Crimson WIPalong that we're running. And the Crimson WIPalong is a sort of knit-along, make-along initiative that I am hosting over on Instagram, as well as over on my Discord server for the Crimson Stitchery. And if you don't know, Discord is basically a forum or a chat group that's a little bit more personal, where you can get to know people a little bit more. And as part of that, over the course of 6 months, we are aiming to clear the decks in terms of our WIPs, our works in progress, and finish at least 50% of our projects. Either finish them or frog them, just get rid of them, unravel them, throw them in the bin, move on before, starting anything new. So that's proven to be very, very successful. And recently I did also host the winter edition of our quarterly virtual stitch night, which is one of the perks available to my Patreon supporters. And that was also really productive in terms of getting on with WIPs and sharing them with each other. And as one of my Patreon supporters has commented, it's really great to have a reason to finally finish some of these long-standing projects. So on that note, this video is coming to you courtesy of all of my lovely and wonderful supporters over on Patreon, who keep the Crimson Stitchery going through monthly membership subscriptions in exchange for a range of different perks, a really large one of those being forming a really lovely and close-knit, unfortunate pun, community online where we get to support each other, ask questions, share our successes, and provide advice in those areas where we face a little bit of challenge, maybe. So if you enjoy the Crimson Stitchery and you're interested in maybe getting involved a little bit further, you can check out the different tier benefits over on patreon.com/thecrimsonstitchery. And I just want to emphasize that the monthly contributions of any form, they really, really do make a huge difference in terms of the operating costs of running the Crimson Stitchery. They help me invest in this YouTube channel, and the income really largely goes towards things like software and equipment. So thank you so much for that. Without your contributions, I genuinely wouldn't be able to keep the Crimson Stitchery going, and I think it's become a really wonderful online space for discussion and learning and thinking and sharing the joy of making. So head over to patreon.com/thecrimsonstitchery to check that out if it tickles your fancy. On that note, let's talk about the WIPs that I have been working on. I went through all of my WIPs in January, towards the beginning of January, and I made a list of all of the projects that I found. But actually, after I'd filmed and uploaded that video, I actually found a few more projects hanging around. So I think in the original video I found 10 projects, and then I think it went up to about 13, possibly 14. And with those extra ones, stuff that I literally completely forgot about, or there were also a couple of projects that I had pre-committed to and I knew I was going to have to start. So even though, as part of the WIPalong, we were meant to clear the decks in terms of finishing half of our existing projects before starting new ones, there were a couple of projects that actually I had already agreed to do. It's just I hadn't cast them on yet, but plans had already been made, action had already been started in other areas. So some of the WIPs that I have finished, I've got one to hand here in my knitting basket that's just on the floor next to me. And one of them is this shawl. This is something that I did show in the WIPalong video, because I basically started this really gorgeous chunky grey shawl that's knit in using 8mm needles, and it works up really quickly because I had this vision for this lovely simple shawl that had like the ideal and the perfect scalloped border, and I knit this about 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, and basically I went through loads of different iterations of the scallop, and I just couldn't get it right. I tried like different versions of different kind of lace patterns and different increase and decrease shapes, and it just didn't work out, and so I, you know, threw it aside. And I did actually have an idea of what I'd need to do in order to create the perfect scallop, because, you know, when you've got just this vision in your head and it's just not being achieved, yeah, so I had a vision of what I needed to do, but for some reason I just thought it was going to be much more difficult than it was, and it ended up being fairly straightforward. I still had to you know, spend some time on like calculations and all of that kind of thing, so that was another reason why I procrastinated on knitting in my perfect scallop. This is the point of the triangle, so I'm quite pleased about that. So it's quite dainty, it's very pretty. And I guess I was in the mood for that at the time, pretty things. I don't know if I'm in the mood for that at the moment. But this shawl, you can see I've just got to sew in the end. I'm so pleased at finishing it. It's finally achieved the vision that I had. So it was a very simple project, really ideal for beginners because it teaches you quite a few different techniques, and then using chunky weight yarn, using 8mm needles, it really does work up pretty quickly. And although it, you know, 8mm needles, you might think that the knit is like really heavy, but it's actually not, because the yarn is knit at quite a loose gauge. So just lots of ingredients, you know, lots of little different attributes that all come together in a really speedy project that teaches a surprisingly large amount of knitterly skills and techniques. So I am planning on making this into a knitting pattern at some point in the future, but if you're not aware, I'm basically in the middle of trying to finish my PhD thesis. I'm currently in the middle of rewriting it, and it's really intense, and yeah, I'm having to be a bit of a one-track mind, so things that are kind of intellectually stimulating or demanding are very much falling by the wayside, which is a shame. But you know, at a certain point you've just kind of got to get the big project done. So I'm able to kind of continue doing fun and light-hearted things like finishing off knitting projects, and also continuing to try and keep the Crimson Stitchery going meanwhile, but I just don't seem to have the mental capacity to engage in anything kind of too rigorous or demanding. And yeah, apparently editing patterns and like using Adobe InDesign and stuff like that, apparently all of that is just too demanding. So there's just not enough hours in the day, basically. So yeah, on that note, patterns are kind of gonna be pretty much on hold for the rest of 2023, with one notable exception that we will get to later in the spring. Again, because of sort of pre-commitments and deadlines that had already sort of been into place. But yeah, I hope that you'll bear with me while that is going on, because honestly, like, editing a thesis is just actually not very fun. So yeah, it will be good to have something to look forward to and to sort of be a stimulus to and an incentive to get past that finish line. On that note, before I talk about my next WIP that I finished, you might spot, eagle-eyed viewers might spot that I'm wearing something underneath this pink jumper, and I often forget to talk about what I'm wearing in my videos, but in the show notes, in the more extended show notes that I upload to my blog, thecrimsonstitchery.com/blog, I do discuss, I do make a section for what I'm wearing in that, so I kind of do it in hindsight. But yeah, so I've got my Aureus cardigan on top, but underneath I've got the Knitted Dicky, which is the pattern that I designed for Making magazine and that was published in the winter gifts edition. I think it was back in November, beginning of November or so. Yeah, and I've finally had the sample returned to me, so thank you so much Making magazine, because I did an amazing job on the photography and just putting together this absolutely gorgeous digital issue with so many like wonderful projects that I just again really want to start at least one other thing in that, like some of the decorations and so on that they have in it, and like even the other knitting patterns in it are really appealing, but I'm having to be really strict on myself in terms of what I spend my time on, which sucks. But like I said, only so many hours in the day. But yeah, so I've got this piece back, Knitted Dicky, which was their title for it. I would have gone for something a little bit more characterful myself, but this is what happens when you collaborate and work with other companies. And I've really been enjoying wearing it just as a little layering piece, and I'm definitely getting much more wear out of it than I anticipated. I kind of just wanted to design and make it as a challenge, like just as an idea of creating something, but I'm finding that I love wearing it because, as you can see, it ties on at the waist, and it's all very elegantly done, like the trimming with like a 1x1 rib, and then the ties are in a 1x1 rib. And yeah, it uses loads of different stitch patterns on the front, as you can see, but then they're all related because they're all variations upon some form of rib, basically. And I actually wrote quite an in-depth blog post again on my blog, which I'll link to down below, where I talked about the design inspiration in terms of hand stitching, as in like stitching samplers and quilting stitches and so on. So it was inspired by different forms of handcraft, essentially, that I then tried to translate and convey through knit. So that it was really an intellectual exercise in like textile methods and history in a way, upon this one little garment. But the reason that I like it is, well, firstly, the yarn is really special. I was really fortunate in that the yarn that was provided for this design is by Woolfolk, and it's this really soft, like ultra fine merino, and it really is soft, you know. I don't have a problem with wearing wools that are a little bit more robust or a little bit more brusque, if you like. I don't normally have a problem, you know, layering up and so on, and wearing something that's got a little bit more toothiness and let's just call it what it is, scratchiness. You know, as an outer garment, sometimes that can actually be a really good thing because it can mean that the yarn is more hard wearing. So yeah, just to like be able to work with something so soft and luxurious, and yeah, it was pretty nice. So yeah, the yarn is lovely, and just the fact that you can just kind of put it on and then it ties on at the side, so it's very flexible, literally, and then your arms don't get caught up in it. So there's a lot of like aeration that can happen as well as warming around your core. And it's got this turtleneck, but I designed the turtleneck on purpose, like fairly wide for what it is, which means that if you're wearing like another turtleneck sweater underneath, like a tighter one or like a thermal layer, you can still, sometimes I've got two. I've got a thinner polo neck as well, and then this chunkier one on top, so it still works. And then it's just great for layering, like when it's underneath a cardigan or a jacket, you don't really see that it's actually quite narrow. So yeah, this Knitted Dicky is it's quite a small piece, and again I do feel inspired to make more actually, and maybe one that's slightly wider or a little bit larger, because it's petite. And the pattern I wrote for 3 sizes, so there are different widths. I think they get a little bit longer as well. But overall, this one has been designed to have quite a slender profile. So I think it would be nice to have one that is just slightly wider, you know, just a ½ an inch or a centimetre or so on each side, just to take up a little bit more space. But yeah, again, that's another thing to put on the shelf for the future. So yeah, that's the Knitted Dicky that I'm really enjoying wearing, and I will be releasing the pattern as a standalone, but now, as I mentioned, it's available as part of this like really bumper booklet or issues. So honestly, I'm not their sales force, I can promise you, but that's the only way you can get it for now. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad investment to buy that digital download, put it that way. Okay, so the next two projects that I want to talk about, one was a whip that I was showing you, and one was a mentally committed whip. as again we've been chatting about in the Discord server, mental whips, things that you'd sort of pre-committed to even as, you know, you're going into the whip along. And I don't have them to hand, so I'm just going to be showing pictures of them as we go forth. But the first one is the 1x1 ribbed hat that I made for my sister. I managed to finish that pretty quickly and gave it to her, and she was gracious enough to let me take these pictures of her looking very sweet. It's a pretty simple pattern. Again, we'll write it up at some point. Honestly, I feel like making this video is just basically an explanation of a to-do list, so I'm sorry if that's tedious in any way, but as you can see, you know, I have great enthusiasm for this and just not enough hours in the day. But yes, so what I love about this hat is that I knit it very long, and it can have a very, very deep brim and be worn like a skull cap, or the brim can be unfolded and it can just be worn as a sort of droopy, wee willy winky nightcap slash, you know, grungy kind of look, or it can just be folded up and worn as a straightforward 1x1 ribbed beanie hat with a with a pom-pom at the end, which was what she requested. She was very adamant on having a pom-pom. And yeah, I think she looks really, really sweet in it, and it was just so nice to make something simple that I didn't have to, you know, almost worry too much about. I will say that it did still take quite a bit of experimentation to get the crown right, and I'm glad that I persevered. So yeah, that was really gorgeous, and the yarn that I used was a leftover hank of a worsted hand-dyed yarn by Urban Pearl that, as I mentioned before, was left over from another design project. So that was like a double win or a triple win, because it's like I finished a whip, I used something from my stash, and I gave something to my little sister because she needed a new hat. So yeah, that was all around great project, and yeah, really happy with that, and would really like to knit more plain simple hats, but not allowed because of the whip along, right? So it's quite good to have these boundaries in that sense. The next whip that I finished was the mental whip, or the previously committed whip, and that was another pair of oregano socks. So I've got the yarn that I used here. So the oregano socks is a design that I did for Julie of Black Isle Yarns using her Killen sock blend. I released the pattern a little while back, and the original pattern is written for 2 weights of yarn, a sport weight yarn and a normal fingering weight yarn. And the reason for that primarily was because Killen is, you know, Black Isle Yarns is this very small yarn company, and what often happens with very, very small yarn companies is that because of the sizes of the batches that they're working with and the nature of the relationship that they have with like the wool mills, there can be slight variations from batch to batch, and basically the old batch of Killen was sport weight, was heavier, but subsequently the new batches that she has made have all been in the 4-ply or fingering weight yarn, so like a standard sock yarn in other words. So I decided that it would be a good idea just to make a sample of the oregano socks using the 4-ply weight yarn, because that is now what is available. And, you know, regardless of, you know, whether you have an old hank of Killen or a new one, you know, depending on how long you've been keeping it in your stash for, just, you know, check the yarn label, see what the weight is. Like, this is quite a basic advice, I think, for when you're just purchasing from smaller companies, basically, because, you know, when you're not producing things on such a huge mass and scale, it's basically there can be just more variation. And this colour that I chose to knit the new sample in is this lovely soft hand dyed sort of sage green. It's really, really luminant because of the blend of fibres that are in Killen, which is blue-faced Leicester wool and mohair, both of which have got very long staple lengths and are very light reflective because of that. It's hand dyed using botanical tinctures, like all of Julie's dyeing practices are, and this uses nettle and was it bramble? It was some kind of weed with a bit of indigo to get this soft green tint, and it's very, very subtly tonal, and it's just really, really pleasant. So it's this really fresh spring green that's very enlivening to wear, especially as spring is sort of on the horizon these days. And I don't have the sample with me because I have lent the sample to Julie as she is doing things like yarn festivals over the next couple of months. So if you follow her, and you know, she's based in the Highlands of Scotland, but she's traveling around to various different places on tour doing yarn festivals. So if you sign up to her Instagram and her newsletter, you can get her news. Not being paid, again, not a member of the sales force, just a very happy collaboration. And this has been one of the loveliest things about the Crimson Stitchery. Has definitely been making connections with other small businesses and sort of forging, if you like, a really positive network through that, as well as making connections with other makers. So it's definitely like a social endeavour, and I hope that knitting can be for you as well, whether that is in person or online like it is for me. So yeah, that's the socks. And as you can see, I've not got tons of leftovers. I was hoping to have more leftovers so that I could do a nice stripy sock, because look, here I've pulled out some other leftovers of Kelen that I have. So this golden is left over from the Sicimbrium sweater that I did, and then I've got some plain bleached but not dyed, I think, white, which I had used for swatching and to test out the yarn and so on before she started dyeing with it. And you know, they could be all striped together in a sock, or you know, maybe they could be a vest. I'm not normally a fan of the sweater vest. I know that they have become more and more popular these days, but I think that's why I quite like the Dickie, because it's kind of like a sweater vest, but then having like the ties are a nice little detail, and having the sides open is something quite fun and versatile. And again, you don't get too hot. I think that's the main advantage of it, warm but not overheating. So yeah, I don't know, it could be something striped or just a plain old vanilla striped sock. I'm not sure, I haven't decided, but as much as I would love to cast on just another simple, easy project, I've got to work through my whips for the Crimson WIPalong, and that is keeping me honest. Okay, so those are the three projects that I've managed to finish. The shawl, which needs blocking, the hat and the socks, which is quite a lot, to be honest with you, for a month, especially since I haven't had tons of time. And yeah, that's meant that I've managed to tick off a fair number of projects off my list, my whip list, and yeah, if I can sort of do the same again, then I'll be approaching my 50% kind of minimum kind of thing, and I am aiming for more like 75% done before I cast on something brand new. You know, ideally 75–80%, that's what I would like to do, and having a deadline and sort of sticking to this minimum 50% finished projects thing is quite good, because it's really forcing me to contend with those longer standing projects that were just hanging around, and it's really yeah, there's nothing like a deadline to get stuff done. So yeah, I would really like to finish more, but you know, we'll see how it goes. I'm definitely sticking with it, and grateful for the other people that are, you know, we're all just cheering each other along, whether on Instagram or in our Discord server. So the last project that I wanted to talk about is my contribution to this community textile and art project in East London called Traces Stories of Migration, and I talked about this at length in the last episode of the Crimson Stitchery, so episode 61. So I'm not going to reiterate on all of that here now. Just I'll put a link on screen if you haven't caught up on that episode yet for whatever reason, or if you're new to the Crimson Stitchery. But basically I was going to do 3 contributions to that. I'm going to do 2 now, and I talked at length about the first one. And the second one is the story of the socks that are not a sock, and they're not a sock because they're not designed for wearing. They've been knitted as an art piece, They're not suitable for wearing because it's not a proper sock yarn. It's just 100% wool yarn, so I don't think it would be hard wearing enough to wear. Maybe just as like a bed sock, but you know, it's a symbolic representation of a sock in the same way that, you know, like a Christmas stocking might be. And I talked a lot in the last episode in depth about, you know, why I've chosen red and why I've chosen wool and why I've sourced wool from Scotland. And in this pair of socks, so what I have planned to do is basically have 2 socks, because the whole sort of story about my contribution, my contribution rather, is to do with sort of thinking about migration and heritage, and thinking about that in terms of me as a sort of person in the present. I think I've been thinking a lot about like collective memory and community history, and this is something that I've been working on in my PhD as well, so I'm thinking about it like intellectually as well as in a personal sense, and as well as in a creative sense. But there's something about how we've moved in society from kind of collective forms of being to very individualistic forms, especially in the West, in Europe, in North America, and especially in a sort of urban setting. It's all about like the individual going out alone and doing things, and as opposed to sort of doing things within the community or like the whole group doing things. And that's definitely oversimplifying what the situation is like, don't get me wrong, especially when it comes to sort of the mythologies around like settler colonialism and so-called self-sufficiency. The mythology of that obviously like in the American West, but also maybe in like, you know, the Australian outback as a form of colonialism. So I'm not going to get into that. Gosh, it's so easy to like open up. This is something that I find really satisfying about sort of cultural writing on textiles and dress, which is the discipline that I sit in intellectually, right, in sort of fashion and dress studies, about how you can take just one thing and use it to open up, you know, much wider discussion about culture, society and history. I love it. It's why I'm putting myself through this grueling process of trying to finish my thesis, so that I can take some of the stories that I have recorded within that in terms of my primary research and then craft, you know, much even further interesting narrative forms around those. So yeah, anyway, what was I talking about? Collective and individual. And in a way, you know, the way that I think about like my own personal heritage, it's very much been about the collective and about things that other people have done. But for one reason or another, I just wanted to insert myself much more firmly in the narrative, or rather assert my own journey. So I've knitted, I've been working on a series of slippers and socks basically to represent the metaphor of standing on my own 2 feet, and sort of knowing that you have the past behind you to support you and let it guide you into the future, but that you are the individual actor. That's really what I'm getting at. And so in the sock I've knitted my initials, A.T., Anushka, Te. And I think I'm going to exhibit the sock as it is in terms of the fact that it's unfinished, like the ends are still here and it's unblocked. And I knitted my initials in just knit and purl, AT here, and I have 2 names. I have a name in English language, or rather I have a Romanized name, and I have a Chinese name. And so what I had done is I had worked out a way, you can kind of just about see, because it's very faint just because of the way that I drew this graph, but you can see it's sort of cursive, the A and the T, it's slightly curly-whirly, and I've also got my name in simplified Chinese characters here, which is Zhen Huixing. And the reason that my surname is different in Chinese, or Mandarin rather, and English is because of a misspelling when the British colonisers did a census in Malaysia. They misspelled or misheard or misspelled, you know, it's a pretty common thing. So my surname as represented in English is very different to what it would be For people, like for instance, for people that never left China and still have that same surname. Like even someone said to me like, oh, is that how you pronounce this character in English? And was just really confused. And I was like, oh no, well, you know, it's kind of made up in some ways. And that's kind of funny as well, because it's also like we can ascribe so much importance to names and naming, but at some point someone just made it up and did a misspelling. So yeah, so I was gonna have two socks, one with my English initials and then the other one with my Chinese characters for my name. I wanted to do a knit and purl so that it was quite subtle in a way, and that you had to kind of really scrutinise and look at it, as opposed to doing intarsia or using different colours where it would be really bold and obvious. But the thing is that with the Chinese characters, it's just too subtle. It's just way too subtle. And I mean, now I'm looking at it on camera. It looks like you can see it, but I feel like you can't really read it. It's almost easier on camera because of like the lighting and the shadow, but in real life it's really hard to read what it's meant to be. So I kind of stalled on this, but I really need to hurry up with the second piece because I need to send it all off basically. Like there's a deadline, another deadline. So what I'm thinking of doing is actually going back to that idea of intarsia and colour, and I think I might just do duplicate stitch on top. I might just knit the sock plain with no name in it, and then find another colour of red yarn, and I'm not gonna have time to like order the same yarn in a different shade, unfortunately. I'll just have to find any old red yarn and do a duplicate stitch on top of it. In another shade of red, so that it's still very, very subtle. And you know, maybe it's okay that they are, you know, they already weren't matching in terms of the two socks, but maybe it's okay that they're using different techniques. And I think it's very possible to find a lot of symbolism within that, or thinking about sort of things that are knitted in as part of the form as opposed to things that are applied on top, as almost like an applique, you know, in terms of duplicate stitch. So it's possible to be very poetic about anything if you have the imagination. On that note, I've been watching and then rereading Anne of Green Gables recently, and really finding it quite hilarious as an adult. I think I've been enjoying the Netflix adaptation very, very much because I like the fact that it's an interpretation that is like a commentary on romanticizing the past. Obviously, it's changed the books. It's you know, it's added in plot lines and, you know, sub-stories that are of more interest and relevance to an audience today, arguably. But what I really like is the fact that it doesn't itself romanticize the past. It's quite clear about when things are quite bleak and awful. And when I then decided to reread the books. So I'm just on the first one, Anne of Green Gables. And it's interesting because you know, comparing it to the Netflix adaptation, I can see the difficulties of daily life, which in the narrative of the book, they might be mentioned, but then, you know, it's like they just move on from it and they don't dwell on it. And the whole thing is about like optimism. And emotion, basically. The whole book is about emotion and the sort of difficulty of feeling too much, or the fear of feeling too much, because it might, you know, if you then lose something, if you kind of cared too much about it, it would be like that loss would be magnified. This is what the whole narrative centres around, the two main female characters, like Mirilla, the older woman, and Anne, the little girl. But yeah, so anyway, the point is that I'm reading the books and I can see like where the people that wrote the TV adaptation have sort of seized one tiny little comment and then actually fleshed it out quite a lot more. And so on TV, it's quite obvious, like when stuff is really awful, they really make it awful, whereas in the book they just sweep it under the rug. Everything gets swept under the rug, under the rug, under the rug, and then I don't know at what point the rug is just gonna like explode. But anyway, reading the books as an adult is quite hilarious, and that is something that is quite nice to do, sort of revisit books that you read a long time. Gosh, I must have read that book when I was 8 years old. Yeah, after such a long, so like over 20 years, like nearly a quarter of a century later, rereading the books and just getting such a different different perspective on it. It's quite delightful. It's something I would I recommend that you do. And also, like, you kind of, you get shocked by things that were not shocking at the time, like racism basically in it as well, which is something that shouldn't be. I think it's important, not, you know, whilst you can say, oh well, people thought differently back then, actually, you know, not everybody thought that way back then, because otherwise we wouldn't have ever progressed. Okay, so it's good to acknowledge that there were always dissenters, you know, but also it's just important not to forget, and so that we know how far we have moved on. And yeah, there's been a lot of stuff in the news recently that I've seen regarding, like, Roald Dahl's books and how they've been, like, re-edited to change certain descriptions or certain formulations of his characters and so on and so forth. And it's such a tricky one, but I think at the moment, the way I'm thinking at the moment, you know, especially having done the project that I did about the colonial documents at Kew Gardens Archives. So that was a project that I did over 6 months, from August to January last month. Yeah, after having sort of, it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and I think it's good to leave things as they are, to preserve the historical record, so that we can remember that we shouldn't, like, behave like that anymore. Does that make sense? You can tell me what you think, or if it's okay to kind of clean things up and just changing them. I don't know. I think the point I'm trying to make in terms of Anne of Green Gables is that they're two distinct texts. There's the book, and then there's an adaptation of the book for television. Basically, they're two different things, as opposed to sort of the idea of trying to tamper with the original source. That's where I am at the moment, but I also think that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that every case should be understood separately, although that could be reason to accuse people of hypocrisy, maybe. But I think that there are often differences, or maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, on that note, just mentioning the Kew placement. So for anyone that isn't aware, I spent 6 months as an artist in residence at the archive of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. I was working with a colonial collection of documents, or a collection of colonial documents, maybe I should say, or both. And I was making work in response to it, as well as interpreting those materials for various different activities, including an exhibition. I did some workshops, I wrote some blog posts, and most recently I've made a podcast about the work, because I made some sounds and I did music, and so it was really fitting to convey that through a podcast genre. I'm on the latest episode of Technicast, which you can get, you know, wherever you listen to podcasts, but again, I'll put a link to that down below, so please do listen and let me know if you do have a listen. Okay, on that note, I'm going to wrap things up. And thank you so much for watching, and again, a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, and a shout out to my supporter at the Crimson Queens tier, which is the highest level. Thank you so much, Angie Scheitel, for your ongoing support of the Crimson Stitchery. If you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the thumbs up button down below and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Meanwhile, drop me a comment, let me know what you've been working on, and if you've been taking part in the Crimson WIPalong over the last month. I would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, take care, happy knitting, bye bye.